So today what I'm going to show you is how to get started with watercolors. So what I have is my watercolor palette. I have a few different brushes. I have two glasses of water. So the first one is going to be used for cleaning my brushes, and then the second one is for using clean water to dip into the paint. And then this is where I'm going to paint onto. Then I also have a scrap piece of paper, and what I'm going to use that for is to test out the colours before I go straight into my painting. And I also have a piece of kitchen paper, just so that if I get too much water onto my page, I can dab it up. Then also I recommend using good quality paper, so if you can get watercolour paper, that's great, but if not, then just the best quality paper that you can get. So we're going to start off by mixing a colour. So if I want to make a nice brown colour, I'll go for, I know there's brown in that palette, but I'm just imagining if you didn't have brown. So I've wet my brush, then I rub it on the colour block, and then I drop the colour into the lid of my colour palette. Okay, so there's an orangey red. Then I might add in some yellow. So dip your brush into the water, rub it on the colour block, and then drop it into your palette. Okay, and I'm going to try and make brown using a bit of red, a bit of yellow, and a little bit of blue. Okay, I'd use the blue sparingly. Sometimes blue, when you drop it in, it kind of takes over. So just use a little bit of blue at first. Okay, add a bit more. Okay, so it's starting to look a lot more like brown now. So brown is, you'd use it a lot in landscapes. Okay, so instead of going straight onto my page, I'm going to just test it out here. Okay, so let's say I'm happy with that colour brown, and I'm going to start painting. The other thing I want to show you is there are two different techniques commonly used in watercolour painting, the wet on wet technique and the wet on dry technique. So if you wet your page before you put the paint down, just like I'm doing here, so just with normal water, and the watercolour paint is going to go on in a nice wash. Or otherwise, if you leave your page dry, the colour will come out a lot more concentrated. Okay, so I'll show you the wet on wet. You'll find that the paint spreads really easily, so really quickly over a big large area. And what you might do is, if you're using the wet on wet technique, is you would come back and build up layers. So if you wanted, for example, this side of the circle to be shaded, you'd wait for this to dry and then add another layer along the side here. Then the wet on dry technique, do you see how the paint doesn't travel as much, and it does come out a little bit more concentrated? So if you want lovely flowy effects, then you can use the wet on wet, but if you want to use a lot of control and be very precise, and use the wet on dry. But I think what's really unique about watercolour is when you allow all the colours to kind of bleed and have dark areas and lighter areas, and maybe even mix in different colours. So imagine I was going to drop in a little bit of blue into that. If you should let this dry, but if you're willing to take the risk, you could add in another colour. But what you'll see is that the colours are going to start bleeding into each other because that's still wet. But you can use this technique to get really, really interesting effects. And that's an introduction into watercolour. Don't be afraid to use your tissue paper if you need to pick up any excess water. And that's how to get going.